Hello viewers, welcome to K Diagnostics. Dio here. Today we have a 2008 Freightliner Sprinter with a 3.0 liter. The complaint on this Sprinter is the engine cranks but it doesn't start. So basically it's a crank no start condition. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna confirm the complaint. After confirming the complaint, we're gonna connect a scan tool to the vehicle to see what kind of trouble codes we have in the engine computer. After we retrieve the trouble codes, then we will talk about what directions we're gonna go so we can fix whatever that's causing this engine to crank but not start. So now let's confirm the complaint. Now we're gonna confirm the complaint. So we're gonna insert the key. And now I'm gonna try to start it. Let's see what happens. As you guys can hear, the van is cranking, but it doesn't start. Let's try that one more time. So key is on. So now let's crank it. I hope you guys can hear the engine cranking. The engine cranks, but it doesn't start, okay? So now with the key on, as you can see, all the lights on the dash illuminate initially. The check engine light is on, which tells me that the computer is powered. So we're good there. So let's crank it one more time. As you can see, it cranks, but it doesn't start. So we have confirmed the complaint. So now I'm gonna get the scan tool connected to the vehicle, and then I'll bring you guys back up so we can scan the engine control module. So I got the scan tool connected to the vehicle. I'm gonna turn the key on. So I'm gonna bring up our scan tool. We are working outside, so I'm sorry for the glare. So just bear with me. Hopefully we can get this car started and drive it to the shop. So let's see what we got. So let's go to scanner. As you can see, we have 4 trouble codes in the engine computer. The first trouble code is 2201, lost communication with electronic ignition switch, central gateway module. And then the second one is 2243, lost communication with electronic ignition switch, central gateway module. So this first one is just the same as the second one, okay? So the same code, but listed twice. And then the third one is 2209, lost communication with ABS/ESP. So ESP stands for electronic stability program. And then the fourth code is 2045, crank sensor no signal. So the fourth trouble code over here is what's causing the engine to not start, okay? From experience, I can already tell, because if the crank signal is not making it to the engine computer, the computer won't know the position of the pistons in the cylinders, so it's not gonna fire the injectors, which will prevent the engine from starting, okay? So now let's scroll down and see what else we have in the other modules. And the other code is U1401, implausible engine speed signal received. So this over here has something to do with the crank sensor or the crank sensor circuit. Okay, so this is starting to look like this is gonna be a pretty easy one. So let's keep scrolling down. We got some communication errors in this Parktronic control unit. Now on the generic side, our code is P0335 and it says crankshaft position sensor A circuit. Okay, so our problem is probably a defective crank sensor or a problem in the circuit between the sensor and the ECM. So now what I want to do is I want to go to the engine computer. So let's click on engine. Let's read the codes again. As you can see, we have 4 trouble codes. Now we cannot fix all these codes at the same time. We're gonna have to pick one. Since the complaint is the crank no start, so I'm gonna focus on this crank sensor trouble code, this crankshaft sensor no signal code. So we're gonna back out. I am going to erase these trouble codes, and then we're gonna crank it again and see which trouble code will come back first, okay? Now, the rule of thumb is whatever trouble code that comes back first is what you have to address, and then worry about the other ones later. So all these trouble codes over here are saved on the scan tool. So I'm gonna go back and clear the codes. So now all the codes are cleared. Let's try to read the codes again. So no codes present. Let's back out. So now let's crank the engine and see what happens. So I'm cranking the engine. So the engine cranks, but it doesn't start. All right. So now let's go back to our codes and see if there's any trouble code. Let's read the codes again. So right there, only the crank sensor no signal trouble code came back, okay? This 2045 trouble code. Okay, so this is what we're gonna address first. And I'm pretty sure once we fix this crank sensor no signal trouble code, this vehicle will start, okay? So now let's back out. Oops, I'm sorry for the glare, guys. So let's back out of here. On the generic side, it said that this code is P0335. So that's good to know. Let's back out of here. Let's just go to the engine computer. And there's no troubleshooter over here. I was gonna look up this trouble code in the troubleshooter and see the code setting criteria and the possible causes of this trouble code. Now, this is pretty self-explanatory. Let's read this code again. Okay, so 2045 crankshaft sensor no signal. So this trouble code over here is pretty self-explanatory. This code is set when the computer doesn't receive a signal from the crankshaft position sensor. And this can be caused by a defective sensor itself or an open in the wiring between the sensor and the engine computer. Now, the open could be in the signal wire. If there's an open in the signal wire between the sensor and the computer, the sensor could be creating a signal and sending it to the computer, but since the wire is open, if that were the case, since the wire is open, that signal is not going to make it to the computer, okay? Now, most of these sensors are Hall effect sensors, so there are 3 wire sensors. One wire is going to have ground, the other wire is going to be the voltage supply, and then the third wire will be the signal. So the sensor could be missing ground, and if the sensor misses ground, it's not going to create a signal, so the sensor is not going to work. Or it could also miss a power supply. If it's missing power, the sensor is not going to work either, okay? So now let's back out of here. What I want to do is, since that's the only trouble code that's coming back, I want to go to our guided component test. And we're going to look up this sensor. I mean, I'm working outside and I'm not connected to the internet. So I would like to see how this sensor is wired, but I can't access my wiring diagrams right now because I want to know if this sensor receives its power feed from the computer or from a fuse, because I know some Hall effect sensors, I mean, I'm pretty sure this is most likely a Hall effect sensor. Some of them receive power from a fuse, from an external fuse, or some of them receive power from the engine computer. And then as they receive power and ground, when the engine is spinning, as the trigger wheel passes across the tip of the sensor makes a signal which tells the computer the position of the pistons in the cylinders, okay? And then the engine computer fires the injectors and then the engine starts. So our engine computer is not receiving this signal and we gotta find out why. So we're gonna go to component information. So here we can read about this crank sensor. It says the crankshaft position sensor, which is a Hall effect sensor, detects the crankshaft position by detecting the location of missing segments on the tone wheel. which is mounted to the flex plate. The electronic control module, ECM, detects top dead center position of cylinder 1 with the crankshaft position sensor signal. Injection timing is synchronized according to the camshaft signal and the crankshaft signal. The crankshaft position sensor is also used to detect engine speed. Okay, so basically when the computer does not receive a signal from this sensor, from this crankshaft sensor, it cannot start the engine. Okay, because the computer needs the input from this sensor to know the piston position so it can fire the injectors and everything else. Okay, now the best place to test this sensor is at the sensor itself. So it says here the crankshaft position sensor is mounted at the left rear of the engine, just above the starter motor. The crank sensor is somewhere on the bell housing, just above the starter motor. Okay, and the best place to do the test is at the sensor connector. Now, if we look at, since I cannot access my wiring diagram, over here at the sensor connector, it says pin 1 is the sensor ground, and pin 2 is sensor signal, and then pin 3 is the 5-volt supply, so the 5-volt reference. So this sensor receives 5 volt from the computer, and then ground, I'm pretty sure this is also computer ground, and the second wire, pin 2, is the signal. Now, what we're gonna do is, since on the generic side it says that our code was crank sensor circuit A, that was the code on the generic side of the tool. So this is pretty straightforward and pretty easy to test. What we're gonna do at this point is we're gonna go to the sensor and disconnect it. Since this is a Hall effect sensor, we should have 5 volt on pin 3, and then we should also have 5 volt on pin 2. Why 5 volt on pin 2? Because there is, on Hall effect sensors, there is a voltage on the signal wire, usually 5 volts or 4.5 volt. This voltage comes from the computer, and once the voltage gets to the sensor pulls it to ground to create a signal. Okay, so first things first, we're gonna go to the sensor, disconnect the sensor electrical connector. We're gonna back probe all these 3 wires. We're gonna use our scope over here to monitor the signals on all these wires. We're gonna monitor the voltage that we're gonna have on all these wires. So 2 of these wires should have 5 volts, and then we should have about 0.1 or 0.2 volt on the ground wire. Okay, and after that we're gonna reconnect the crank sensor and then crank the engine to see if our sensor is making a signal. Okay, so after disconnecting the electrical connector of the sensor, if we see 5 volt on the supply wire and close to 5 volt on the signal wire, that will tell me that the wiring integrity between the ECM and the sensor is good. So basically, the unplug test we're gonna do first is to check the circuit between the ECM and the sensor. Okay, so with the wiring disconnected, if we have 5 volts on both wires, close to 5 volts on both wires, and 0.1 or 0.2 volts on the ground wire, that will tell me the wiring is good, and our problem will most likely be the sensor or the reluctor wheel on the flywheel, the flex plate, which is, I don't think it's the case, but it's starting to look like we have a defective sensor. So we're not gonna just replace the sensor. Let's go under the vehicle and do some tests. So now let's do that. So we are outside the van. So now we have to get access to the crankshaft position sensor. Now, I'm working outside. I don't know if I mentioned that already. I don't like working outside, but we have to get this van started. So we don't want to tow it. We have to get it started so we can drive it to the shop. And since it's probably just gonna need a crank sensor, so I don't mind fixing it out here. So as you can see, the van is pretty low, so I cannot crawl under the van, so I can get access to the crank sensor. So what I gotta do is I gotta jack it up a little bit so we can crawl under the van and get to the crank sensor. So what I'm gonna do right now is I'm gonna get a jack and a jack stand and lift up the van a little bit so we can have enough room to crawl under the van. So I will do that off camera. I will lift up the van and then I'll bring you guys back up once the van is lifted so we can get access to the crankshaft position sensor. So I will do that and then I'll bring you guys back up. So I got the van jacked up and ready to go. So now let's crawl under the van so we can do some tests at the crankshaft sensor. We are here under the vehicle. The crankshaft position sensor is located over here. So this is the electrical connector of the crankshaft position sensor, okay? It's just right here above the starter. All right, so this is the connector for the crankshaft position sensor, and as you can see it has 3 wires. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna back probe these 3 wires. So I'm going to back probe the first wire. So first wire is back probed. So now we're gonna back probe the second wire, and then after I back probe all the wires, I'm gonna disconnect the connector and see what type of voltage we have on these wires. Okay, so the second back probe is connected to the wire. So now we're gonna do the last one. I don't know if I already said it, but I hate working outside. I don't like it. All right, so we got all the wires back probed. Okay, I hope you guys can see we got all the wires back probed. So now I'm gonna use some long test leads. We're gonna use some long scope test leads that will allow us to connect to the sensor wires and the scope inside the vehicle. So this is gonna go to the first back probe is gonna go to this green test lead. So now the second one, I'm gonna connect it. So I'm gonna connect this one to the yellow test lead. Now, I don't really care what wire is what, okay, at this point. I mean, this is a pretty simple circuit. It's a Hall effect sensor, so one is gonna be 5 volt, the other one will be the signal, and the third one will be ground. So we know that already. I'm just gonna back probe all of them, and once we look at the voltages on the lab scope, we will know like what's what, you know? We will know which one is the signal and which one is the 5 volt supply and the ground. Okay, so as you can see, I back probed all the wires on the sensor connector. Okay, so right there. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna disconnect this electrical connector. So right there. So the connector is disconnected and we got all our 3 wires back probed. I hope you guys can see that. Okay, so all the wires on the connector are back probed. So now let's go inside the vehicle and look at what we're gonna find on the lab scope screen. So we got our test leads coming from under the vehicle right there. And these test leads are coming from the crankshaft sensor electrical connector, okay? So now we're gonna connect these to the lab scope. So the first one is gonna go over here. Now we just need to connect the first ground, okay, the one on the first channel. And then we don't have to connect the other one because all these channels over here are grounded internally. So now let's grab the green one and connect it. Last one. All right, so we got all our test leads connected to the lab scope. Wow, I'm sorry for the glare, guys. So let's put this up here. I hope the test leads will probably not get all the way up there. Actually, maybe let's come down here. I'm sorry for the glare. So let's go to the home button because now we gotta go to the lab scope. So let's go to scope multimeter. Let's go to lab scope, 4-channel lab scope. Now we're gonna turn on 3 channels, and we're gonna stay on the voltage scale since we're gonna be measuring voltage. So we're gonna put all of them on the 20 volt scale. Let's turn off the filter for now. No trigger. It's always a good practice to not set the trigger when you are acquiring a signal for the first time, okay? So we are all set. As you can see, we got all our 3 channels turned on. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna turn the key on first. Let's see what we got. So let's turn the key on. So the key is on. With the key on, we should have 5 volts on 2 of these channels over here. So as you can see, with the key on, we have 5 volt on the green trace and the yellow trace. So the green trace and the yellow trace, these two have voltage. I mean, they have 5 volts because one of them is the 5 volt supply, and then the other one is the signal coming from the computer, which is supposed to have 5 volts, okay? So now let's look at some digital numbers. So as you can see, we have 5.2 volts on the green trace and then 4.91 volts on the yellow trace. So the yellow trace is the signal wire, and then the green trace is our 5 volt supply. How do I know that? Because we have 5 volt, which is a 5 volt supply on the green trace, which is supposed to be there, so that's good. This is our 5 volt supply, and then the 4.91 is our signal wire, okay? And then the ground is 0.01, which is good. Okay, let's refresh this. So right there, 4.91 volts on the yellow trace, 5.02 on the green trace, and then 0.01 on the blue trace. So our ground is good. So the blue trace is the ground, green trace is the 5 volt supply, and then the yellow trace is our signal wire, okay? So we're good to go. Our circuit is good. So this tells me that the wiring between the engine computer and the crank sensor is good, okay? With these voltages that we have here, the circuit integrity is perfect. Our circuit is good. So now that we have confirmed that the circuit is good, we checked it, it passed the test, our circuit doesn't have a problem. Let's go back under the van and reconnect the sensor. After we reconnect the sensor, we're gonna crank the engine, and while we're cranking the engine, this yellow trace over here should basically produce a square wave, okay? We should see a square wave over here on the yellow trace. If we don't see a square wave on this yellow trace while we're cranking the engine, the problem is gonna be a defective crank sensor or a problem in the reluctor wheel, okay? The trigger wheel of the sensor, which I don't think is the problem. The problem is most likely the sensor itself, okay? So now, let's go back under the van and reconnect the sensor. So we are back here under the vehicle. As you can see, our crank sensor electrical connector is disconnected. Our wiring is good. We don't have a wiring problem. So now I'm gonna reconnect this electrical connector to the crank sensor. So let's reconnect this. So right there, as you can see, I reconnected the crank sensor. We're still back probing the wires, okay? Our wires are still back probed. So now let's go back inside the van and crank the engine to see if there will be a waveform on the yellow trace. I'm sorry if it's been loud. It's so windy out here. I'm working outside, which is my least favorite thing to do. So let's finish this diagnosis and figure out what's the problem with this van. So right now, with the crank sensor plugged back in, we still have 5 volts on the green trace, and we have the 4.91 volt on the yellow trace, so we're good. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm going to crank the engine. Okay, so I'm gonna crank the engine up here, and then I will have you guys focused on the lab scope screen. So as you guys can hear, I'm cranking the engine, but there is no square wave on the lab scope. Okay, now the good thing is our 5 volt didn't drop, our ground also didn't get elevated. As you can see, our ground is good, our voltage supply is good, and our signal is still there. You know, the voltage on the signal wire is there. But as I'm cranking the engine, I hope you can hear the engine cranking, nothing is happening. So no square wave being created from this sensor. Okay, so let me crank it one more time. All right, so 2 things. At this point, I'm pretty sure our problem is most likely the sensor or the reluctor wheel. And I don't think the trigger wheel has an issue on this van, but we're still gonna check it though. What we're gonna do is, now that we know our wiring is good, I'm gonna remove the sensor. We're gonna get the sensor out, and then we're gonna use a mirror to look into the sensor hole and inspect the trigger wheel. I'm gonna bump the key to see if the trigger wheel is spinning while I'm looking at the trigger wheel through the crank sensor hole. Okay, I'm gonna have to have someone to bump the key for me while I'm checking the trigger wheel. And if the trigger wheel is spinning as the engine is cranking, that would tell me that our trigger wheel is good. Our trigger wheel is connected to the flex plate to the back of the engine, and at that point the problem will be the crank sensor itself. And I'm pretty sure this is gonna need a crank sensor. So let's go back under the vehicle and remove the crank sensor. So we are back here under the vehicle again. So I'm gonna disconnect the electrical connector of the crank sensor. So I got the electrical connector of the crank sensor disconnected. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna remove the crank sensor. And the crank sensor is right over here. Okay, I hope you can see that sensor right there. So the sensor is right here. So this is the sensor. The sensor has 1 bolt that bolts it onto the bell housing. I'm gonna remove that bolt and slide the sensor out. Once I pull the sensor out, I'm gonna inspect the trigger wheel through the sensor hole. I'll have someone bump the key while I'm inspecting the trigger wheel. So when someone bumps the key, so basically someone is gonna crank the engine, and what I will be looking at is the trigger wheel spinning. Okay, the trigger wheel has to spin. Since it's attached to the flex plate, it has to spin as the engine is spinning. So if the trigger wheel spins, that will tell me that the trigger wheel is good, and at that point the problem will be the sensor, and I'm gonna go ahead and order the sensor at that point. Okay, so I will do that off camera. I'll bring you guys back up once I get the sensor out and after I inspect the trigger wheel, because I can't really bring you guys up there to show you. I'm just gonna have to put a mirror up there against the exhaust manifold and have someone bump the key so I can see if the trigger wheel will be moving as the engine is spinning. Okay, so you're just gonna have to take my word for it, whatever results I'm gonna get, and then we'll go from there. So I'm gonna remove the sensor. So I already cracked the crank sensor bolt. So as you can see, I'm starting to remove it with my fingers. So here's the crank sensor bolt. So now I'm gonna pry the crank sensor out. So here comes the crank sensor. So this is our sensor right here. Okay, so we're gonna get it out of the way. So now I am going to get a mirror and check the reluctor wheel through the sensor hole. Okay, so I'm gonna put a mirror up here and check the reluctor wheel through the sensor hole. All right, and then if the reluctor wheel is good, I'm gonna order a new crank sensor. All right, guys, so I did check the reluctor wheel off camera. The reluctor wheel is good. I had my friend come here and bump the key for me. The reluctor wheel is definitely spinning with the engine, so we're good. Our problem is not the reluctor wheel. The problem is a crank sensor. So I'm gonna go ahead and order a crank sensor, and then I'll bring you guys back up once I receive the new sensor so we can install it, okay? So I will get a new sensor ordered, and then I'll bring you guys back up once it comes in. So I have received a new crank sensor from the Mercedes dealership. So this over here is the old crank sensor. So this is the defective one. And then this part number over here is the part number for the new crank sensor. So let's get the new one out of the bag. So right here, this is the new crank sensor. As you can see, it looks identical to the old one. Okay, so they both look the same. So now let's go under the vehicle and install this sensor. After we install it, we're gonna reconnect the electrical connector. I'm gonna keep my test leads still connected to the crank sensor electrical connector, and then we're gonna come back here and watch what we're gonna see on the lab scope screen. With the new sensor installed, I'm sure this vehicle will start. When we crank the engine, it's gonna start, and while the engine is running, we will see a square wave on the yellow trace. Okay, there will be an on and off square wave on the yellow trace after we install this sensor. Okay, so now let's go under the vehicle and do that. All right, so now we're gonna install the new sensor. So the sensor hole is right around this area. So right there, the sensor is installed. So now I gotta get the bolt in. So now we're gonna get the bolt in place. So we're gonna tighten the little bolt for the crank sensor. All right, so that's tight. We're good. Oops. So now we're gonna reconnect our electrical connector of the sensor. Oh man, the tab over here broke, so I'm gonna have to fix that later. Or we're gonna have to replace this electrical connector. Anyways, this is not gonna prevent us from finishing our test. Okay, so right there, the electrical connector is reconnected to the sensor. So now let's go back in the van and start it. So if the problem was the sensor, right now there will be a square wave on the yellow trace and this van will start. So now let's go inside the vehicle and test our repair. We are back in the vehicle, hopefully for the last time. So now I'm gonna crank the engine. So key is on. As you can see, we have our supply voltage and the voltage on the signal wire, so we're good. So now I'm gonna crank the engine. So right there, as you can see, the engine started and the engine is running. So I'm gonna decrease my time base. Okay, and I'm also gonna decrease my voltage here. So we can see more detail. Okay, Perfect. So the problem was a defective crank sensor. As you guys can hear, the engine is running and we have a square wave here. Okay, so right there. Now let's give it gas. Let's accelerate. So that's good. The engine now runs. Okay, so this is fixed right there. So I'm gonna turn off the engine. Let's start it. So right there, as you can see, the engine runs, so we're good to go. So we're good. This is fixed, guys. So now I'm going to turn off the engine. We're gonna turn the key on. We're gonna erase the trouble code. Remember that crank sensor trouble code was coming back. So we're gonna erase it now, and since we replaced the sensor, it won't come back. Let's go to codes. Okay, our crank sensor no signal trouble code is there. So let's back out and let's clear the code. So right there, the code is cleared. Let's read the codes again. Right there, no codes present, so we're good. So now let's back out. Let's go back to the lab scope. I'm gonna start the engine. So right there, we have a square wave on the lab scope screen. Everything is good. Let's look at the dash. No check engine light. Okay, that light is on because the door is open. So no lights on the dash. So this is fixed. The van is now running. So just for the heck of it, let's scan this one more time before we wrap up this video. And I'm sure that trouble code is not coming back. So let's go to codes. So right there, no fault codes present. Remember before, that code was coming back really fast. Okay? So we're good. Let me start it again. So right there, this van is fixed. Alright guys, so this is fixed. So now let's turn off the engine and wrap up this video. So I'm gonna leave this right over here. This van is fixed. As you guys saw, this vehicle now runs. Before it was a crank, no start condition, but now it runs. We connected a scan tool to the vehicle. We retrieved the trouble code. The code was saying that there was no signal coming from the crank sensor. We checked the crank sensor wiring. The wiring was good. We checked the trigger wheel on the flex plate through the crank sensor hole, which I did off camera. The trigger wheel was good. I ordered a new sensor. We installed the sensor. With the new sensor installed, we could now see a square wave on the lab scope screen, which told me that this vehicle was fixed. And when we cranked it, the engine started, and now everything is fine and we're good to go. So I'm gonna leave this right over here. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did enjoy the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumb down. But if you do, you gotta tell me why so we can make better videos in the future. If this is your first time here, subscribe to the channel. Ring the bell so you can get notified every time I upload a new video. If you have any comments, questions, criticism, leave them in the comment box. It's getting dark here. I gotta get out of here. So I'm glad we were able to fix this. Thanks for watching. See you next time.